Right. The fifth and final chapter of Counsels and Maxims is titled The Ages of Life. Unlike the previous chapters, it is not divided into numbered subsections, but because it's 25 pages long, I'm going to divide it up into parts myself, and I will number each of those parts continuously with the previous sections. So although Schopenhauer does not call this section 54, that's what I'm going to call it. In this first selection that I have for you today, Schopenhauer introduces his project in the chapter, and he explains why it is that the years of our youth appear to be so much happier than the rest of our lives, especially when we look back at them in memory. And he gives, I think, four different reasons for this. Briefly, these are the lesser role that will plays in the life of children, a somewhat surprising claim that Schopenhauer defends at length. Second, that the knowledge we acquire as youths helps to create the categories through which we understand and classify our later adult experience. Third, that children see the world objectively, that is, as object, not as subject. I'll try to explain just what Schopenhauer means by that because I think his use of those terms can be a little bit confusing. And fourth, that when we are children, because we are earlier in our lives, we are more similar to each other. And that it's when we hit puberty, when we hit adulthood, that we begin to diverge and become more and more different from each other. Schopenhauer concludes this section I'm giving you today with some ruminations on why it is that the transition into young adulthood is always marked by a kind of disillusionment. No matter what kind of youth we've had, we always come in our teen and early 20s years to feel that we have been deceived somehow, that the scales or illusions are falling away from us. So that's my summary of what's to come. Here's what Schopenhauer writes. Chapter 5, The Ages of Life. There is a very fine saying of Voltaire's to the effect that every age of life has its own peculiar mental character, and that a man will feel completely unhappy if his mind is not in accordance with his years. Qui n'a pas l'esprit de son âge a tout le. It will therefore be a fitting close to our speculations upon the nature of happiness if we glance at the changes which the various periods of life produce in us. Our whole life long it is the present, and the present alone, that we actually possess. The only difference is that at the beginning of life we look forward to a long future, and that towards the end we look back upon a long past. Also, that our temperament, but not our character, undergoes certain well-known changes, which make the present wear a different color at each period of life. I have elsewhere stated that in childhood we are more given to using our intellect than our will, and I have explained why this is so. Footnote. Translator's footnote, the reference here is to Weltashwille und Vorstellung, Book 2, Chapter 31, for those of you who want to look that up. It is for just this reason that the first quarter of life is so happy. As we look back upon it in after years, it seems a sort of lost paradise. In childhood, our relations with others are limited, our wants are few. In a word, there is little stimulus for the will. And so our chief concern is the extension of our knowledge. The intellect, like the brain, which attains its full size in the 7th year, translator's footnote notes that this is not entirely correct. I'm going to pass that by. In the 7th year, is developed early, though it takes time to mature, and it explores the whole world of its surroundings in its constant search for nutriment. It is then that existence is in itself an ever-fresh delight, and all things sparkle with the charm of novelty. I'll pause there to note that this he's not finished with this topic yet, but the idea that children have less will and more intellect in their lives may surprise us. We might be inclined to think just the opposite, that people become intellectual as adults, as certainly later on in their lives, as teenagers perhaps, and that they are all will, sort of little bundles of desire as children. Schopenhauer is claiming precisely the opposite. He says here, in what we've just read, that our relations with others are limited, our wants are few. There's little stimulus for the will. And what Schopenhauer is talking about here is that the will that takes a place in his larger philosophy of life in The World as Will and Representation. Will for Schopenhauer is something like this sort of fundamental life force. It is what lies beneath human existence and all animal existence. It is a kind of limitless striving. It's a desire for fulfillment. It's striving is the good word for it. It always stretches itself out and wants something, desires something, desires to be fulfilled. We see this most easily in the lives of animals, lower animals beneath us, dogs and cats and rats and other animals. They want to continue to live, they want to reproduce, they have desires, they want to satisfy them. For Schopenhauer, however, the key element in wisdom, the thing that the wise man realizes, the beginning of wisdom, is that desire is insatiable, that we will never fulfill our desires. We will never achieve the happiness that the satisfaction of desire seems to promise. And it's realizing that will, rather than being a sort of direction towards a good to be possessed finally, is a kind of pointless, irrational striving that is itself a source of misery. That's really, I think, the core of Schopenhauer's overall philosophy. So when he says children have less will about them, this is good for the children because it means they have less sort of striving and wanting and less sort of that sort of passionate, sort of eagerness to have the longed for thing. Instead, they're much more sort of drinking in the world, right? Experiencing things as they are, having experiences without this sort of undercurrent of desire and striving and wanting and lusting after things, which is ultimately pointless, which is the thing that we as adults, hoping to be wise, are struggling to eventually to quiet and to overcome. So when he says children have less will, I think that's what he means there, is that they have less of the kind of striving that characterizes the miserable existence of the adult world. So he goes on. This is why the years of childhood are like a long poem. For the function of poetry, as of all art, is to grasp the idea in the Platonic sense. In other words, to apprehend a particular object in such a way as to perceive its essential nature, the characteristics it has in common with all other objects of the same kind, so that a single object appears as the representative of a class, and the results of one experience hold good for 1,000. Okay, the word idea is capitalized in this paragraph. We're talking about the Platonic form. It's to experience the horse in front of you as, in a sense, all horses, okay, or whatever object, the apple as all apples, the particular as representative of, as really, in a sense, being the universal, the entirety of things. Children, he says, do this. We don't do this as much as adults, as he'll say next. He goes on. It may be thought that my remarks are opposed to fact, and that the child is never occupied with anything beyond the individual objects or events which are presented to it from time to time, and then only insofar as they interest and excite its will for the moment. But this is not really the case. That is, this is an inaccurate presentation of what childhood knowing is like. In those early years, life, in the full meaning of the word, is something so new and fresh, and its sensations are so keen and unblunted by repetition, that in the midst of all its pursuits, and without any clear consciousness of what it is doing, the child is always silently occupied in grasping the nature of life itself, in arriving at its fundamental character and general outline by means of separate scenes and experiences, or, to use Spinoza's phraseology, the child is learning to see the things and persons about it sub specie aeternitatis, as particular manifestations of universal law. Here, perhaps surprisingly, we have Schopenhauer telling us that children experience the world more truly and more fully than we do. They live more completely than we do, relatively unburdened by the sort of downward pull of will and of striving. He goes on. The younger we are then, the more does every individual object represent for us the whole class to which it belongs. But as the years increase, this becomes less and less the case. I'll pause here to note that we might have memories of this from our own experience as children, right? Your father represents every father, right? The sense which work or play in the particular context in which you live it in as a child is for you the universal meaning of that concept, that activity, that practice, that the assumption that all that the things of your experience are general and universal for the whole human race, for all of reality, is present there right at childhood. That's how children know and think. Okay, but as we get older, we acquire more diversity in the objects of our experience and our awareness changes. Schopenhauer goes on. That is the reason why youthful impressions are so different from those of old age. And that is also why the slight knowledge and experience gained in childhood and youth afterwards come to stand as the permanent rubric or heading for all the knowledge acquired in later life. Those early forms of knowledge passing into categories, as it were, under which the results of subsequent experience are classified, though a clear consciousness of what is being done does not always attend upon the process. This is the kind of thing a person might discover in therapy, for example, that your assumptions about women or about men are informed by these childhood experiences that have set up categories of friend and enemy, mother and girlfriend, etc., that are determining the way in which you engage with the adult world in which you now live. So a little bit of sort of pre-Freudian psychology here from Schopenhauer as well. Continuing. In this way, the earliest years of a man's life lay the foundation of his view of the world, whether it be shallow or deep. And although the view may be extended and perfected later on, it is not materially altered. It is an effect of this purely objective and therefore poetical view of the world, essential to the period of childhood, and promoted by the as yet undeveloped state of the volitional energy, that as children we are concerned much more with the acquisition of pure knowledge than with exercising the power of will. Hence that grave, fixed look observable in so many children, of which Raphael makes such happy use in his depiction of cherubs, especially in the picture of the Sistine Madonna. The years of childhood are thus rendered so full of bliss that the memory of them is always coupled with longing and regret. So what do we have here? This is simply, again, that looking back upon our childhood, because it was a period of not of struggle and striving for goals. We think of the goals of adulthood, of acquiring money, of achieving goods, of maintaining social relationships, of moving on in our career and our job, of worry about the future. Children are just content to know things, to experience things, to grasp this horse as representative of all horses, to look at the thing in front of them, to experience it fully in its most objective sense. So, continuing now with Schopenhauer. While we thus eagerly apply ourselves to learning the outward aspect of things as the primitive method of understanding the objects about us, education aims at instilling into us ideas. But ideas furnish no information as to the real and essential nature of objects, which, as the foundation and true content of all knowledge, can be reached only by the process called intuition. This is a kind of knowledge which can in no wise be instilled into us from without. We must arrive at it by and for ourselves. Adding to this to what's come before, we might say that children have this kind of intuitive, poetic gaze upon the world, this acquisition of intuitive knowledge, much more easily than those of us who have been subjected to education, this attempt to impart ideas from outside. Schopenhauer goes on. Hence, a man's intellectual, as well as his moral qualities, proceed from the depths of his own nature, and are not the result of external influences. And no educational scheme, of Pestalozzi or of anyone else, can turn a born simpleton into a man of sense. The thing is impossible. He was born a simpleton, and a simpleton he will die. Bit of Schopenhauerian determinism here in the realm of education. Okay, perhaps against the progressive spirit of his own time, maybe in terms of the ambitions of the German educational system. I don't know the details of that. It is the depth and intensity of this early intuitive knowledge of the external world that explain why the experiences of childhood take such a firm hold upon the memory. When we were young, we were completely absorbed in our immediate surroundings, and there was nothing to distract our attention from them. We looked upon the objects about us as though they were the only ones of their kind, as though indeed nothing else existed at all. Later on, when we come to find out how many things there are in the world, this primitive state of mind vanishes, and with it, our patience. Okay, so concluding this line of thinking that I've just been speaking about, education is not going to do much compared to this sort of intuitive drinking in of the world that we do as children, that we will later grow out of. Continuing. I have said elsewhere, footnote, World as Will and Representation, Book 2, Chapter 31. I have said elsewhere that the world, considered as object, in other words, as it is presented to us objectively, wears in general a pleasing aspect, but that in the world considered as subject, that is, in regard to its inner nature, which is will, pain and trouble predominate. I may be allowed to express the matter briefly thus: the world is glorious to look at, but dreadful in reality. And here I'll try to explain what I think Schopenhauer means by objective and subjective. I think we have here a successor to the Kantian phenomenal-noumenal distinction. If I can bring that in briefly here, the way things appear to us, the appearance of things, their presence in our experience, this is what children deal with, the sort of objective reality of the world as object, and it's beautiful, it's pleasing, it's attractive, it's fun. But the children do not encounter the world as subject. And by subject, I think he means here its inner reality, its noumenal reality, what's really going on beneath the surface of all the appearances. And that is, for Schopenhauer, will, right? There's this sort of irrational, limitless, unsatisfiable striving or desire. This wanting, right? We might say children are not hungry in the way that adults are hungry, right? Sort of hungry for knowledge, hungry for things. Hungry in this way that is ultimately futile and miserable, says Schopenhauer. So that's the subjective reality of things. That's the true reality of things. That's what the wise man discovers and then learns to detach himself from by minimizing the role of will in his own life, in his own self, in his own mind and behavior. So children aren't yet to that point yet. They're still at the objective stage. So we might say, as he said previously in a previous section, comparing life to a sweet shop, right? The colored sugar candies in the case are so beautiful and diverse and wonderful and pleasing to the eye, but when you get them out of the case and put them in your mouth, you discover that in themselves, they're all made of the same sugar paste, right? They're all just kind of tasteless goo once you've taken a bite out of them. Life is like that, Schopenhauer seems to say, is that it's at the objective level, it's beautiful and attractive and promises all sorts of great and glorious things. And then when you become old and you realize what it really is in itself, when you encounter the world as subject, as will, you realize that it's that life is pain. Theme of Schopenhauer's entire philosophy. Going on. Accordingly, we find that in the years of childhood, the world is much better known to us on its outer or objective side, namely as the presentation of will, than on the side of its inner nature, namely as the will itself. Since the objective side wears a pleasing aspect, and the inner or subjective side with its tale of horror remains as yet unknown, the youth, as his intelligence develops, takes all the forms of beauty that he sees in nature and in art for so many objects of blissful existence. They are so beautiful to the outward eye that, On their inner side, they must, he thinks, be much more beautiful still. So the world lies before him like another Eden, and this is the Arcadia into which we are all born. A little later, this state of mind gives birth to a thirst for real life, the impulse to do and suffer, which drives a man forth into the hurly-burly of the world. That is to say, we grow up, right? We want to move out in the world and do things, not just be children our whole lives long. There he learns the other side of existence, the inner side, the will, which is thwarted at every step. Then comes the great period of disillusion, a period of very gradual growth. But once it has fairly begun, a man will tell you that he has got over all his false notions. L'âge des illusions est passé. And yet the process is only beginning, and it goes on extending its sway and applying more and more to the whole of life. So it may be said that in childhood, life looks like the scenery in a theater, as you view it from a distance, and that in old age, it is like the same scenery when you come up quite close to it. Okay. I think I like that metaphor even better than the sweet shops metaphor. The theater of the stage looks gorgeous, beautiful, very entrancing, sort of transports you to another world if you are 50 feet away from it. You come up quite close to it. The closer you get, the more you see. It's cardboard. It's painted plywood. It's not even painted very well, just enough to fool the eye from far away. So that process of coming closer to the same cheap scenery is the process of getting older. As a young person, as a youth, as a child, oh, wow, it's gorgeous, it's beautiful. It must be really even better up close. And then you get up close as you get older and older and older, and you say, actually, it was always kind of cheap and of low quality. So it was always that way. I was fooled before. And lastly, there is another circumstance that contributes to the happiness of childhood. As spring commences, the young leaves on the trees are similar in color and much the same in shape. And in the first years of life, we resemble each other and harmonize very well. But with puberty, divergence begins, and like the radii of a circle, we go further and further apart. The period of youth, which forms the remainder of this earlier half of our existence, and how many advantages it has over the latter half, is troubled and made miserable by the pursuit of happiness. I should say by the pursuit of happiness, as though there were no doubt that it can be met with somewhere in life, a hope that always ends in failure and leads to discontent. As I said before, the essence of will is that it's insatiable. It can never actually achieve the object of desire. There's a sort of fundamental irrationality about the universe and our place in it, a universe characterized by will, according to Schopenhauer. An illusory image of some vague future bliss, born of a dream and shaped by fancy, floats before our eyes, and we search for the reality in vain. So it is that the young man is generally dissatisfied with the position in which he finds himself, whatever it may be. He ascribes his disappointment solely to the state of things that meets him on his first introduction to life, when he had expected something very different, whereas it is only the vanity and wretchedness of human life everywhere that he is now for the first time experiencing. Okay. So here's the source of disillusionment, right? A man thinks that his expectations of youth were going to be paid off, and when they're not, when the inner reality of the world, of life, is different from the outer, when he had expected them to be similar, he feels cheated. He feels like there's something that's been snatched away from him or batted out of his hand or put beyond his reach. And again, the Schopenhauerian wise man recognizes that there never was anything that could satisfy this longing, this desire that is will. It would be a great advantage to a young man if his early training could eradicate the idea that the world has a great deal to offer him. But the usual result of education is to strengthen this delusion, and our first ideas of life are generally taken from fiction rather than from fact. That's the end of this section of The Ages of Life, Chapter 5 of Schopenhauer's Counsels and Maxims. That's all I'll share with you today, talking about the nature of childhood and its relation to this sort of fundamental phenomenon of will that Schopenhauer thinks is the most important fact about this world and our existence in it, whether we can be happy or less miserable. We'll take a look at the next section in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. Hi. In the next part of Chapter 5 of Counsels and Maxims on the Ages of Life, Schopenhauer contrasts youth with maturity, the first half of our life with the second half. He concludes with, I think, a really interesting metaphor about the difference between the way things seem to us in youth and in age. Here's what he writes. In the bright dawn of our youthful days, the poetry of life spreads out a gorgeous vision before us, and we torture ourselves by longing to see it realized. We might as well wish to grasp the rainbow. The youth expects his career to be like an interesting romance, and there lies the germ of that disappointment which I have been describing. What lends a charm to all these visions is just the fact that they are visionary and not real, and that in contemplating them we are in the sphere of pure knowledge, which is sufficient in itself and free from the noise and struggle of life. To try and realize those visions is to make them an object of will, a process which always involves pain. Schopenhauer's footnote. Let me refer the reader, if he is interested in the subject, to the volume already cited, Chapter 37, and that's Volume 2 of The World as Will and Representation, Chapter 37. Perhaps I'll do a video on that in the future. So what Schopenhauer said here so far, in our youthful days, we have great visions of the future, and insofar as those are purely objects of intellectual contemplation and knowledge, they're just fine. But to make them objects of the will, to long for them, to attempt to achieve them, to want them, in a sense, that's where pain comes in. That's where we begin to suffer. That's where our suffering starts. And this fits with the whole idea of the diminishment of the will being the key to a happy or at least a less miserable life. Schopenhauer goes on. If the chief feature of the earlier half of life is a never satisfied longing for happiness, the latter half is characterized by the dread of misfortune. For as we advance in years, it becomes in a greater or less degree clear that all happiness is chimerical in nature, and that pain alone is real. Accordingly, in later years, we, or at least the more prudent amongst us, are more intent upon eliminating what is painful from our lives and making our position secure than on the pursuit of positive pleasure. I may observe, by the way, that in old age we are better able to prevent misfortunes from coming, and in youth better able to bear them when they come. So, an observation here, one which we might compare to our own experience. Is it the case that as we grow older, especially as we get to be my age and older, that we more and more seek to avoid pain to eliminate misfortune and therefore acquire a kind of security rather than to achieve a sort of positive pleasure? Schopenhauer is mapping this onto his vision that we gradually realize that the reality of this world is that pain is real, pleasure is illusory. What we call pleasure, what we enjoy, is really just the release from pain. And so we shift from trying to achieve the object of our desire to simply trying to eliminate sources of pain and discomfort and unpleasantness within our lives. And this accounts for the way in which, as people age, they become more security-minded. So, going on with Schopenhauer now. In my young days, I was always pleased to hear a ring at my door. Ah, thought I, now for something pleasant. But in later life, my feelings on such occasions were rather akin to dismay than to pleasure. Heaven help me, thought I, what am I to do? A similar revulsion of feeling in regard to the world of men takes place in all persons of any talent or distinction. For that very reason, they cannot be said properly to belong to the world. In greater or less degree, according to the extent of their superiority, they stand alone. In their youth, they have a sense of being abandoned by the world, but later on they feel as though they had escaped it. The earlier feeling is an unpleasant one, and rests upon ignorance. The second is pleasurable, for in the meantime they have come to know what the world is. Interesting paragraph here, right? This is Schopenhauer saying, when I heard the doorbell ring when I was young, what new pleasant thing awaits me. I hear the same doorbell ring when I'm old. I think, what am I to do? How am I to escape this imposition upon me? His suggestion here, he's not really arguing for this so much as simply observing it or claiming it, is that all people of any kind of superior quality or intellect will feel just this way, that they don't belong in the world, that the world's demands upon them are a kind of intrusion from which they would like to escape. So that the young man feels abandoned by the world, the older man feels that he's escaped the world. Okay, so the young man is unhappy because he feels the world owes him more. The old man knows that that's simply not the case at all, that as much detachment as he can get is something to be valued. I think here of the conversation between Socrates and I think it was Cephalus in the or Chaerephon, get the two mixed up, in Book One of Republic, where Socrates asks him what's the greatest benefit of being old, and part of the old man's response is, I feel my libido has gone down, and I feel like I've been released from a terrible and cruel master. So the sense in which having fewer desires to be satisfied, being released from the sort of passionate, hot-blooded drive to satisfy these desires, that itself is a source of consolation and even of what might pass for happiness in Schopenhauer's universe. So going on now. The consequence of this is that, as compared with the earlier, the later half of life, like the second part of a musical period, has less of passionate longing and more restfulness about it. And why is this the case? Simply because, in youth, a man fancies that there is a prodigious amount of happiness and pleasure to be had in the world, only that it is difficult to come by it. Whereas, when he becomes old, he knows that there is nothing of the kind. He makes his mind completely at ease on the matter, enjoys the present hour as well as he can, and even takes pleasure in trifles. The chief result gained by experience of life is clearness of view. This is what distinguishes a man of mature age, and makes the world wear such a different aspect from that which it presented in his youth or boyhood. It is only then that he sees things quite plain, and takes them for that which they really are. While in earlier years he saw a phantom world, put together out of the whims and crotchets of his own mind, inherited prejudice and strange delusion, the real world was hidden from him, or the vision of it distorted. The first thing that experience finds to do is to free us from the phantoms of the brain, those false notions that have been put into us in youth. So here's two paragraphs on the way in which experience tears away the phantom world in which we live as a child. So we become programmed with the idea that the world has a great deal to offer us, that we can achieve pleasure. There's great pleasures to be had. We just have to exert ourselves to attain them. And if we don't attain them, it is because of some kind of fault or flaw. We haven't reached far enough. We haven't worked hard enough. We've been somehow denied or oppressed. But the reality is there never was any such pleasure available. This is what the old man realizes. And this is what experience clears away, the sort of the phantoms of the mind that we inherit from our youth. They dissipate, and then we're able to take pleasure in trifles, to enjoy the moment, right, without the striving of will, which characterizes the younger man. Schopenhauer goes on. To prevent their entrance at all would, of course, be the best form of education. That's the entrance of these phantoms. Even though it were only negative in aim, but it would be a task full of difficulty. At first, the child's horizon would have to be limited as much as possible, and yet within that limited sphere, none but clear and correct notions would have to be given. Only after the child had properly appreciated everything within it might the sphere be gradually enlarged, care being taken always that nothing was left obscure or half or wrongly understood. The consequence of this training would be that the child's notions of men and things would always be limited and simple in their character, but, on the other hand, they would be clear and correct, and only need to be extended, not to be rectified. The same line might be pursued on into the period of youth. This method of education would lay special stress upon the prohibition of novel reading, and the place of novels would be taken by suitable biographical literature, the life of Franklin, for instance, or Moritz's Anton Reiser. It's kind of interesting here. This almost looks like a kind of Schopenhauer's version of the program of education from Plato's Republic. How could we ideally program or shape our children so that they should be correctly oriented to the world as typically only an old man could be? Well, we would have to limit the range of, we'd have to prevent these phantoms from coming into their minds in the first place by leaving nothing obscure, by sharply limiting their horizon, but giving them only clear and correct notions of men. Schopenhauer had no children of his own, and I cannot imagine that he means this really as a practical scheme, but perhaps more to say that this is what you would have to do, most especially no novels. Novels feed the imagination, they feed this longing for a different sort of life, or for any sort of life at all. Going on now. In our early days, we fancy that the leading events in our life, and the persons who are going to play an important part in it, will make their entrance to the sound of drums and trumpets. But when in old age we look back, we find that they all came in quite quietly, slipped in, as it were, by the side door, almost unnoticed. This is a nice kind of observation that we might expect that meeting our spouse or meeting people who will be quite significant for us, they would appear sort of with this sort of youthful enthusiasm. We might imagine that they would appear with the sound of trumpets and drums, or when I meet my future spouse, I'll know that she's the one. I'll just sort of feel it. And what we'll find as an old man looking back, that the main characters of your life sort of entered by the side door of the stage. They didn't come on in a great procession. This seems to me that there's a great deal of truth in that. Last paragraph of this part. From the point of view we have been taking up until now, life may be compared to a piece of embroidery, of which, during the first half of his time, a man gets a sight of the right side, and during the second half of the wrong. The wrong side is not so pretty as the right, but it is more instructive. It shows the way in which the threads have been worked together. That's the end of the passage I'm going to read for today. And I don't have any embroidery with me, but I do have something similar that one of my daughters made many years ago. This is a little plastic canvas thing from 2013 that one of my girls made for me. And it has, as Schopenhauer suggested here, both a front and a back side. The front side looks quite pretty. It's a set of buildings, some numbers, some pink clouds. Okay, quite nice looking. The back, where all the work has been done, not quite so nice looking, right? You see the stitching here. It's not pretty the way that the front is, but it does show you where the threads were crossed over and tied and how the work was done. This is Schopenhauer's comparison. The first half of life, we see the front half of the embroidery. The second half, we see the back side of the embroidery, which is not so pretty, but which is instructive. We see how the threads fit together. So I like this perhaps as much as the metaphor in the previous section about the scenery of a stage play, which you see first from far away and it looks impressive, and then later from closer up and you see it as it truly is. So a little bit deeper metaphor here from Schopenhauer. So that's the second of the several sections that I'm breaking up the ages of life into. We'll take a look at a third section in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. In the next section of Chapter 5 of Counsels and Maxims of the Ages of Life, Schopenhauer begins to discuss what life is like in our maturity after the age of 40, especially for the intellectually superior type of person. This is a group into which he obviously includes himself. He discusses the turn towards misanthropy among this type of person. Why is it that this person, as he ages, always tends to become a despiser of humanity? He also contrasts the cheerfulness of youth with the somberness of old age and provides what I think are some really fascinating reflections on the nature of time and memory and how those are experienced differently by the young and by the old. Here's what he writes. Intellectual superiority, even if it is of the highest kind, will not secure for a man a preponderating place in conversation until after he is 40 years old. For age and experience, though they can never be a substitute for intellectual talent, may far outweigh it. And even in a person of the meanest capacity, they give a certain counterpoise to the power of an extremely intellectual man, so long as the latter is young. Of course, I allude here to personal superiority, not to the place a man may gain by his works. So in this first paragraph, I think Schopenhauer is telling us that the very intelligent, very noble or superior character will not be manifest among other people in youth, because at that point those gifts are not apparent to everyone, and they will be washed out by skill and what does it say here? Skill and age and experience, right? So the young intellectual in competition with the older people who are not so intellectual will not compete well. But as he ages, this will become more manifest, as we'll see as we go on. And on passing his 40th year, any man of the slightest power of mind, any man, that is, who has more than the sorry share of intellect with which nature has endowed 5/6 of mankind, will hardly fail to show some trace of misanthropy. For, as is natural, he has by that time inferred other people's character from an examination of his own, with the result that he has been gradually disappointed to find that in the qualities of the head or in those of the heart, and usually in both, he reaches a level to which they do not attain. So he gladly avoids having anything more to do with them. It sounds very autobiographical if you know a bit about Schopenhauer. Okay? As the man of discernment and quality knows his own quality, he discovers through experience that the vast majority of mankind is not at his level, and he can only be the loser by close association with them. So he naturally becomes a misanthrope and withdraws into his own private circle in order to maintain his superiority. So going on. For it may be said in general that every man will love or hate solitude, in other words, his own society, just in proportion as he is worth anything in himself. Kant has some remarks upon this kind of misanthropy in his critique of the faculty of judgment. And here Schopenhauer gives a reference to that part of the third critique. I've looked it up, and perhaps I'll do a video about it later on. If I do, I'll link it up here right now. In a young man, it is a bad sign, as well from an intellectual as from a moral point of view, if he is precocious in understanding the ways of the world, and in adapting himself to its pursuits. If he at once knows how to deal with men, and enters upon life, as it were, fully prepared. It argues a vulgar nature. On the other hand, to be surprised and astonished at the way people act, and to be clumsy and cross-grained in having to do with them, indicates a character of a nobler sort. The cheerfulness and vivacity of youth are partly due to the fact that, when we are ascending the hill of life, death is not visible. It lies down at the bottom on the other side. But once we have crossed the top of the hill, death comes in view. Death, which until then was known to us only by hearsay. This makes our spirits droop, and from the same time we begin to feel that our vital powers are on the ebb. A grave seriousness now takes the place of that early extravagance of spirit. And the change is noticeable even in the expression of a man's face. As long as we are young, people may tell us what they please. We look upon life as endless and use our time recklessly. But the older we become, the more we practice economy. For towards the close of life, every day we live gives us the same kind of sensation as the criminal experiences on every step on his way to be tried. I don't know that I can improve on that paragraph by explanation. It's really well done, especially the sort of metaphor, as we say in English, of going over the hill and now death comes into sight. And what was before a sort of fun adventure with limitless possibilities now becomes, a sort of accelerating downhill slide as the spirit weakens and we see ourselves drawing closer to this ultimate goal, which is now quite evident to us, where it was concealed for us by the climb that we had ahead of us in our youth. Going back to Schopenhauer now. From the standpoint of youth, life seems to stretch away into an endless future. From the standpoint of old age, to go back but a little way into the past. So that at the beginning, life presents us with a picture in which the objects appear a great way off, as though we had reversed our telescope, while in the end, everything seems so close. To see how short life is, a man must have grown old, that is to say, he must have lived long. It's a great image here, right? That the young man sees the world as though he'd reversed his telescope. All of the objects of his longing are far off, right? He still perhaps is sort of enamored of this drive and this will and struggle, that which Schopenhauer would say is what the wise man gives up as he becomes older. But life is endless, but everything also seems so far away. You have to work so hard. You have to sort of drive all your energy into it because that's the way life is, right? It stretches on into an endless future. Things look like they are, looking through the reversed telescope, close things seem far away. Just the reverse is the case for the older man, right? Everything seems up close. Instead of extending far into the future, the horizon of your life now is the present and whatever small portion of the past you can currently remember. We'll see Schopenhauer say more about memory in the paragraphs ahead. To see how short life is, a man must have grown old. He must have lived long. Continuing. On the other hand, as the years increase, things look smaller, one and all. And life, which had so firm and stable a base in the days of our youth, now seems nothing but a rapid flight of moments, every one of them illusory. We have come to see that the whole world is vanity. Time itself seems to go at a much slower pace when we are young. So that not only is the first quarter of life the happiest, it is also the longest of all. It leaves more memories behind it. If a man were put to it, he could tell you more out of the first quarter of his life than out of 2 of the remaining periods. Nay, in the spring of life, as in the spring of the year, the days reach a length that is positively tiresome. But in the autumn, whether of the year or of life, though they are short, they are more genial and uniform. But why is it that to an old man his past life appears so short? For this reason: his memory is short, and so he fancies that his life has been short too. He no longer remembers the insignificant parts of it, and much that was unpleasant is now forgotten. How little then there is left! If we subtract the unpleasant parts of life, knowing Schopenhauer, we subtract 80%. For in general, a man's memory is as imperfect as his intellect, and he must make a practice of reflecting upon the lessons he has learned and the events he has experienced if he does not want them both to sink gradually into the gulf of oblivion. Now, we are unaccustomed to reflect upon matters of no importance, or as a rule upon things that we have found disagreeable, and yet that is necessary if the memory of them is to be preserved. But the class of things that may be called insignificant is continually receiving fresh additions. Much that wears an air of importance at first gradually becomes of no consequence at all from the fact of its frequent repetition, so that in the end we actually lose count of the number of times it happens. Hence, we are better able to remember the events of our early than of our later years. The longer we live, the fewer are the things that we can call important or significant enough to deserve further consideration, and by this alone can they be fixed in the memory. In other words, they are forgotten as soon as they are past. Thus it is that time runs on, leaving always fewer traces of its passage. So in this long paragraph, Schopenhauer has told us that the reason that life seems short to an old man, the reason why his time horizon is the present and maybe the past 3, 8, 10 years of his life, and then jumping all the way back to his memories of early life, with a lot of the intermediate stuff forgotten. Reason for that is the failure of memory. Reason for the failure of memory is a failure of attention. That because we do not attend to, give concentration to, and review things that are insignificant or things that are disagreeable, both of those things gradually fade. They sort of sink down into the swamp of memory and are lost finally forever. So that when you get to be an old man, you basically have vivid memories of youth and then memories of whatever part of the recent past that you've paid most attention to. Okay. As far as insignificant things, he says here, those are constantly growing in number. Things that you thought were significant gradually lapse into insignificance, and things that are repeated frequently become insignificant by repetition. You no longer pay attention to them, and so your memory of them declines. They sort of disappear from this overall sense of yourself that you compose in memory. Okay. Going on to the next paragraph now. Further, if disagreeable things have happened to us, we do not care to ruminate upon them, least of all when they touch our vanity, as is usually the case. For few misfortunes fall upon us for which we can be held entirely blameless. So people are very ready to forget many things that are disagreeable, as well as many that are unimportant. It is from this double cause that our memory is so short, and a man's recollection of what has happened always becomes proportionately shorter, the more things that have occupied him in life. The things we did in years gone by, the events that happened long ago, are like those objects on the coast which, to the seafarer on his outward voyage, become smaller every minute, more unrecognizable, and harder to distinguish. Again, it sometimes happens that memory and imagination will call up some long past scene as vividly as if it had occurred only yesterday, so that the event in question seems to stand very near to the present time. The reason of this is that it is impossible to call up all the intervening period in the same vivid way, as there is no one figure pervading it which can be taken in at a glance. And besides, most of the things that happened in that period are forgotten, and all that remains of it is the general knowledge that we have lived through it, a mere notion of abstract existence, not a direct vision of some particular experience. It is this that causes some single event of long ago to appear as though it took place but yesterday. The intervening time vanishes, and the whole of life looks incredibly short. Nay, there are occasional moments in old age when we can scarcely believe that we are so advanced in years, or that the long past lying behind us has had any real existence, a feeling which is mainly due to the circumstance that the present always seems fixed and immovable as we look at it. These and similar mental phenomena are ultimately to be traced to the fact that it is not our nature in itself, but only the outward presentation of it, that lies in time, and that the present is the point of contact between the world as subject and the world as object. Footnote, translator's footnote. By this remark, Schopenhauer means the will, which, as he argues, forms the inner reality underlying all the phenomena of life and nature, is not in itself affected by time, but that, on the other hand, time is necessary for the objectification of the will, for the will as presented in the passing phenomena of the world. Time is thus definable as the condition of change, and the present time is as the only point of contact between reality and appearance. So there's some interesting metaphysical stuff there about Schopenhauer's theory of the will as the kind of underlying sort of noumenal reality of all of life, of the self, and then its presentation and its objectification, moving from subject to object. We talked a bit about that in the previous video. I don't want to get into that too deeply because I want to go back over this idea about the memory, the idea of a vivid memory in old age. If you're old, you might be, let's say, 55, 60 years old, and suddenly the memory of something you did, maybe something embarrassing you did in ninth grade, comes back to you, and it's just as vivid and crystal clear as if it had happened, last week. Why would that be? The reason Schopenhauer says is because the intervening, 45 years have just disappeared. You can't call those to mind along with the memory. The memory itself is present, and then there's the you of the present, and the two things are, as it were, kind of adjacent in your mind. And so you feel as just last week you were doing that horribly embarrassing thing, and you're even embarrassed, but even sort of your emotional life today, now as a 60-year-old man, is affected by this recollection, this sort of sudden vivid recollection deprived of the intervening time, which has of course been subject to this sort of gradual sinking into the mud that happens to things in our past that we don't pay attention to, that we aren't mindful of, and devoted to paying attention to, analyzing, and recollecting. So that what we have is, again, the old man, it seems, lives a kind of truncated past. Whatever amount of the past he can remember, all of it's gradually fading away. So we'll go on to the end of this section now. Again, why is it that in youth we can see no end to the years that lie before us? Because we are obliged to find room for all the things we hope to attain in life. We cram the years so full of projects that if we were to try to carry them all out, death would come prematurely, though we reached the age of Methuselah. Another reason why life looks so long when we are young is that we are apt to measure its length by the few years we have already lived. In those early years, things are new to us, and so they appear important. We dwell upon them after they have happened, and often call them to mind, and thus in youth life seems replete with incident, and therefore of long duration. We might say that the young man's life is very densely packed with activities and plans and ambitions and objects of desire, more than he could possibly ever hope to achieve, but they all sort of lie within the sort of horizon of his personality, of his objects, as objects of his intention, of his striving. And even things he's just done, right? He turns them over in memory. This life is full of, like a chest full of jewels for the young person. Okay, going on. Sometimes we credit ourselves with a longing to be in some distant spot, whereas in truth we are only longing to have the time back again which we spent there, days when we were younger and fresher than we are now. In those moments, time mocks us by wearing the mask of space. And if we travel to the spot, we can see how much we have been deceived. That's the end of the section I'm going to read for you today. And I love that image there, that when we have a longing in time wearing the mask of space, I have a longing to be in a certain place. I might say, I'm unhappy with my life now. I wish I were back on the beach in Mexico. This is what's happening here is I go back to the beach in Mexico now as an older man. And I get there and I look around and I say, I guess I didn't want the beach at all. What I wanted was to be 29 on the beach. I want the time, the life, the years that I spent on the beach. I want that, but I can't have that. Schopenhauer's expression there is fantastic, right? That's time mocking me wearing the mask of space. It's like, you really want this place again, don't you? And I really don't. What I really want is I want 1985 again, or whatever the time period was. So that's uh, that's the concluding paragraph of this section, beginning to deal with old age, with maturity, still contrasted with youth, explaining why the memories of our youth remain vivid, while the memories of, say, 10, 20 years ago fade away as we get older. So, hope you enjoyed that, especially those reflections upon the nature of time and memory. We'll look at the next section of the ages of life in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. Hi. In this next part of Chapter 5 of Counsels and Maxims, Schopenhauer gives us a couple of short sections about growing older. He begins with this metaphor of two lamps, both of which burn for a long time, but for different reasons. And he gives us some insight into an observation that each person's character seems to best suit a certain stage of life. Here's what he writes. There are two ways of reaching a great age, both of which presuppose a sound constitution as a conditio sine qua non. They may be illustrated by two lamps, one of which burns a long time with very little oil, because it has a very thin wick, and the other just as long, though it has a very thick one, because there is plenty of oil to feed it. Here the oil is the vital energy, and the difference in the wick is the manifold way in which the vital energy is used. Up to our 36th year, we may be compared in respect of the way in which we use our vital energy to people who live on the interest of their money. What they spend today, they have again tomorrow. But from the age of 36 onwards, our position is like that of the investor who begins to entrench upon his capital. At first he hardly notices any difference at all, as the greater part of his expenses is covered by the interest of his securities. And if the deficit is but slight, he pays no attention to it. But the deficit goes on increasing until he awakes to the fact that it is becoming more serious every day. His position becomes less and less secure, and he feels himself growing poorer and poorer, while he has no expectation of this drain upon his resources coming to an end. His fall from wealth to poverty becomes faster every moment, like the fall of a solid body in space, until at last he has absolutely nothing left. A man is truly a woeful plight if both the terms of this comparison, his vital energy and his wealth, really begin to melt away at one and the same time. It is the dread of this calamity that makes love of possession increase with age. So in this first page, a nice metaphor of two lamps, which both burn for a long time. We might say two ways of living into old age. A thin wick with a modest amount of oil, that is to say, vital energy used very slowly, very carefully, or a thick wick which has a great amount of vital energy behind it, a great amount of oil to burn. So a person with a great deal of sort of inner energy can live a very sort of robust life, or a person might live on a smaller sort of amount of kind of native life force with a much more abstemious lifestyle, is what I take Schopenhauer to be saying here. And then the image, I don't know why he chose the age 36, the image of living off of your interest, in which case the sort of the money automatically generates the money that you live on day to day, and the capital never decreases. But then after a certain age, we enter a kind of decline. And again, analogizing money to vital energy, the idea is that our overall life force is gradually fading away at that point, our late 30s, our 40s, our 50s, until it begins to accelerate and we begin to feel, I can't do the things I used to do. My energy level, my ability, my mental focus are declining, and they're declining at an increasing rate. And I think that's what Schopenhauer is describing here as the feeling that I'm living off of a deficit. The balance is quickly approaching zero, and it would be the worst calamity of all to have both my vital energy and my wealth disappear at the same time. And this accounts in a certain way for a type of greed or possessiveness that afflicts elderly people. He says, as we age, we get more concerned with bodily things, with material things, with wealth, and that's the reason why. Schopenhauer goes on the other hand, at the beginning of life, in the years before we attain majority, and for some little time afterwards, the state of our vital energy puts us on a level with those who each year lay by a part of their interest and add it to their capital. In other words, not only does their interest come in regularly, but the capital is constantly receiving additions. This happy condition of affairs is sometimes brought about, with health as with money, under the watchful care of some honest guardian. O happy youth and sad old age. Continuing the metaphor from before, if we can manage to add to our capital, then we are not only turning a profit, but we are making security against later decline, both in wealth and in health and vital energy. Going on. Nevertheless, a man should economize his strength even when he is young. Aristotle observes that amongst those who were victors at Olympia, only 2 or 3 gained a prize at 2 different periods, once in boyhood and then again when they came to be men. And the reason of this was that the premature efforts which the training involved so completely exhausted their powers that they failed to last on into manhood. As this is true of muscular, so it is still more true of nervous energy, of which all intellectual achievements are the manifestation. Hence those infant prodigies, ingenia praecocia, the fruit of a hothouse education, who surprise us by their cleverness as children, afterwards turn out very ordinary folk. Nay, the manner in which boys are forced into an early acquaintance with the ancient tongues may perhaps be to blame for the dullness and lack of judgment which distinguish so many learned persons. So that's the end of the first of these 3 short sections that I'll be talking about today. And Schopenhauer here citing Aristotle, that there are very few Olympic victors who are consistently strong and excellent physically at a young age and then again at a mature age. The reason being that the kind of training necessary to succeed at a young age spoils your health. He says the same thing is true of the life of the mind, of the nervous energy and intellectual achievement, that the more power exerted in youth seems to be dangerous to the possibility of having that same power available in one's maturity and in old age. And then this kind of venomous observation about child prodigies, people who educated, maybe we might think like John Stuart Mill, according to a certain, he says, hothouse education, a kind of intense greenhouse of intellectual activity, may, perhaps unlike Mill, turn out to be quite mediocre and ordinary as adults. That is, that they sort of burn up all of their creative energy and uniqueness when they are quite young and there's nothing left to sustain a life of excellence later on. And this sort of jab at what we might call classical education today. Young boys who are forced to learn Greek and Latin in their primary years may turn out to be quite dull-witted and lack significant judgment for this same sort of reason. Schopenhauer, certainly no enemy of studying classical languages, but perhaps an enemy of the premature study of classical languages. Going on to the next section now. I have said that almost every man's character seems to be specially suited to some one period of life, so that on reaching it, the man is at his best. Some people are charming so long as they are young, and afterwards there is nothing attractive about them. Others are vigorous and active in manhood, and then lose all the value they possess as they advance in years. Many appear to best advantage in old age, when their character assumes a gentler tone, as becomes men who have seen the world and take life easily. This is often the case with the French. This peculiarity must be due to the fact that the man's character has something in it akin to the qualities of youth, or manhood, or old age, something which accords with one or another of those periods of life, or perhaps acts as a corrective to its special failings. So, an observation that people's character has something in it that seems to match either youth or maturity or old age, and that is the time period at which that person will be at their personal best. It's worth remembering here that for Schopenhauer, character is unalterable. It is just sort of a fundamental fact about a person that wells up through their life. It's not an ongoing, developing sort of thing, I don't think. So it's simply the case that if you are, like maybe many Frenchmen, he suggests, the kind of person who is at his best in old age, then your youth and your maturity might be sort of preparatory to a certain kind of easygoing, flourishing old manhood, we might say. The final section is quite short, and here it is. The mariner observes the progress he makes only by the way in which objects on the coast fade away into the distance and apparently decrease in size. In the same way, a man becomes conscious that he is advancing in years when he finds that people older than himself begin to seem young to him. That's the end of the sections I'm going to be sharing for today. And there's another interesting observation that just as things seem to recede on the coast as we move away from them, we become aware of our age when the people older than us no longer seem elderly or even middle-aged, but kind of robust and in the prime of life. This is the old expression that 50 is the new 30, right? Or now that I am the age that I am, thinking, looking at my grandmother at the end of an age where I thought my grandmother was middle-aged, I say that's not middle-aged anymore. That's the prime of life. When I was 11 years old, I thought that was middle-aged. I thought that was old. But now it seems that that people that age and older seem to me to be quite spry and young. They're not changing. It's my perspective that's changing as I'm moving away. Things are changing size. So there are some observations from Schopenhauer about the process of growing older. The next section of this chapter is 8 pages long, quite long, and we'll take a look at it in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. In this next part of The Ages of Life from Counsels and Maxims, Schopenhauer contrasts old age with youth. He begins by noting that we have more vitality in our youth. We seem to be most alive then. And he notes the fact that the years, the sort of felt experience of time accelerates as we get older. That whereas the years drag by when we are young, they fly by when we are older. And he draws out some of the practical implications of this felt time difference for the affairs and the lives of young people and old people. He does defend youth against some wrongful charges, some unearned disdain that that period of life might attract, but in the end he does award the prize for happiest stage of life to old age. Old people are happier than younger people, in part because they have fewer illusions. Schopenhauer will explain. There is a great image towards the end of this section where Schopenhauer compares the decades of our life to a text and then a commentary upon that text. So watch for that. Here's what Schopenhauer writes. It has already been remarked that the older a man becomes, the fewer are the traces left in his mind by all that he sees, does, or experiences. And the cause of this has been explained. There is thus a sense in which it may be said that it is only in youth that a man lives with a full degree of consciousness, and that he is only half alive when he is old. As the years advance, his consciousness of what goes on about him dwindles, and the things of life hurry by without making any impression upon him, just as none is made by a work of art seen for the 1000th time. A man does what his hand finds to do, and afterwards he does not know whether he has done it or not. I think we've certainly all been there. As life becomes more and more unconscious, the nearer it approaches the point at which all consciousness ceases, the course of time itself seems to increase in rapidity. In childhood, all the things and circumstances of life are novel, and that is sufficient to awake us to the full consciousness of existence. Hence, at that age, the day seems of such immense length. The same thing happens when we are traveling. 1 month seems longer than 4 spent at home. Still, though time seems to last longer when we are young or on a journey, the sense of novelty does not prevent it from now and then in reality hanging heavily upon our hands under both these circumstances. At any rate, more than is the case when we are old or staying at home. But the intellect gradually becomes so rubbed down and blunted by long habituation to such sensations that things have a constant tendency to produce less and less impression upon us as they pass by, and this makes time seem increasingly less important, and therefore shorter in duration. The hours of the boy are longer than the days of the old man. Accordingly, time goes faster and faster the longer we live, like a ball rolling downhill. Or, to take another example, as in a revolving disc, the further a point lies from the center, the more rapid is its rate of progression. So it is in the wheel of life. The further you stand from the beginning, the faster time moves for you. Hence it may be said that, as far as concerns the immediate sensation that time makes upon our minds, the length of any given year is in direct proportion to the number of times it will divide our whole life. For instance, at the age of 50, the year appears to us only 1/10 as long as it did at the age of 5. I'll pause there. It's interesting suggestion here, especially like the angular velocity suggestion. The wheel is turning, the disk is turning, and you are, in a sense, as you grow old, moving from the center of the disk towards the outer perimeter where the angular velocity is higher. The whole disk is spinning at a constant rate, but the points on the outside fly by, where the points on the inside crawl by. That seems to be his metaphor for the experience of time speeding up as we get older. He's referred previously to the fact that we become less sensible of the things around us as we age. The world makes less of an impression upon us. And on the whole, it looks really here like youth has a great deal more to be said for it than old age, with this considered. Although he does say, just as in travel, sometimes, as in traveling, as in youth, we get bored, right? Time hangs heavily upon us, sits heavily on our hands. He'll say more about that in just a few moments. Going on to Schopenhauer now. This variation in the rate at which time appears to move exercises a most decided influence upon the whole nature of our existence at every period of it. First of all, it causes childhood, even though it embraces only a span of 15 years, to seem the longest period of life, and therefore the richest in reminiscences. Next, it brings it about that a man is apt to be bored just in proportion as he is young. Consider, for instance, that constant need of occupation, whether it is work or play, that is shown by children. If they come to an end of both work and play, a terrible feeling of boredom ensues. Even in youth, people are by no means free from this tendency and dread the hours when they have nothing to do. As manhood approaches, boredom disappears, and old men find the time too short when their days fly past them like arrows from a bow. I think I'll pause there. So here again is two effects, right? One, that childhood seems like the slowest and therefore the longest period of life and the place where we make most of our memories, and that the children are more likely to become bored. Why? Because of the way that time passes for them. And old men don't get bored. Even grown men don't get bored in the same way, with the same ease, Schopenhauer seems to say. Going on. Of course, I must be understood to speak of men, not of decrepit brutes. With this increased rapidity of time, boredom mostly passes away as we advance in life, and as the passions, with all their attendant pain, are then laid asleep. The burden of life is, on the whole, appreciably lighter in later years than in youth, provided, of course, that health remains. So it is that the period immediately preceding the weakness and troubles of old age receives the name of a man's best years. This may be a true appellation, in view of the comfortable feeling which those years bring. But for all that, the years of youth, when our consciousness is lively and open to every sort of impression, have this privilege, that then the seeds are sown and the buds come forth. It is the springtime of the mind. Deep truths may be perceived, but can never be excogitated. That is to say, the first knowledge of them is immediate, called forth by some momentary impression. This knowledge is of such a kind as to be attainable only when the impressions are strong, lively, and deep. And if we are to be acquainted with deep truths, everything depends upon a proper use of our early years. In later life, we may be better able to work upon other people, upon the world, because our natures are then finished and rounded off, and no more a prey to fresh views. But then the world is less able to work upon us. These are the years of action and achievement, while youth is the time for forming fundamental conceptions and laying down the groundwork of thought. So here, a suggestion that we must use our youth properly, right? That it is because this sort of immediacy of our experience and knowledge of the world can only be had in youth, because that's when our senses are sharpest, when the impressions that things make upon us are strongest, when we are lively and sort of exposed and engaged with the world. As we have this sort of long, slow withdrawal from the world that characterizes old age, we are less able to receive those impressions. So we gain sort of in processing power what we lose in our ability to grasp the immediacy of experience in the world. So I think Schopenhauer here is envisioning a youth that is well spent drawing in this immediate knowledge of the world, and then an old age that is spent in analysis and processing and coming to a sort of wise set of conclusions about it. If youth is wasted, if you don't get those, you're not able to get that, sort of replace it in old age the way you might like to. Okay. Going back to the text now. In youth, it is the outward aspect of things that most engages us, while in age, thought or reflection is the predominating quality of the mind. Hence, youth is the time for poetry, and age is more inclined to philosophy. In practical affairs it is the same. A man shapes his resolutions in youth more by the impression that the outward world makes upon him, whereas when he is old, it is thought that determines his actions. This is partly to be explained by the fact that it is only when a man is old that the results of outward observation are present in sufficient numbers to allow of their being classified according to the ideas they represent. A process which, in its turn, causes those ideas to be more fully understood in all their bearings. and the exact value and amount of trust to be placed in them fixed and determined, while at the same time he has grown accustomed to the impressions produced by the various phenomena of life, and their effects on him are no longer what they were. So here it seems are two advantages enjoyed by old age, that in old age the person who is older has, we might say, a greater data set from which to generalize. He's seen the results of the different phenomena of life and now knows where they lead, where the man of less experience, the younger man, is only going to have a sort of supposition about those things. And life in the world has less effect upon him. It's less able to disturb, it seems, his thought and his overall state of being. And so he comes to a clearer and truer judgment by thought. He's no longer pushed by the world. He is now able to sort of withdraw from the world and to think clearly about what he's learned from his encounters with it. That's what I take Schopenhauer to be saying here. Okay, going back to the text. Contrarily, in youth, the impressions that things make, that is to say, the outward aspects of life, are so overpoweringly strong, especially in the case of people of lively and imaginative disposition, that they view the world like a picture, and their chief concern is the figure they cut in it, the appearance they present. Nay, they are unaware of the extent to which this is the case. It is a quality of mind that shows itself, if in no other way, in that personal vanity and that love of fine clothes which distinguish young people. Okay. Just a short paragraph about vanity and about the way in which a young person cares about the figure he cuts in the world, about what other people think about him. This seems to be another vanity of which the old are generally free. Schopenhauer again. There can be no doubt that the intellectual powers are most capable of enduring great and sustained efforts in youth, up to the age of 35 at latest, from which period their strength begins to decline, though very gradually. Still, the later years of life, and even old age itself, are not without their intellectual compensation. It is only then that a man can be said to be really rich in experience or in learning. He has then had time and opportunity enough to enable him to see and think over life from all its sides. He has been able to compare one thing with another, and to discover points of contact and connecting links, so that only then are the true relations of things rightly understood. Was the old P.G. O'Rourke line that age and guile beat youth and experience and a bad haircut. Some of you might remember that book from the 80s. Further, in old age there comes an increased depth in the knowledge that was acquired in youth. A man has now many more illustrations of any ideas he may have attained. Things which he thought he knew when he was young, he now knows in reality. I might say he moves from supposition to knowledge, to certainty. And besides, his range of knowledge is wider, and whatever direction it extends, it is thorough and therefore formed into a consistent and connected whole. Whereas in youth, knowledge is always defective and fragmentary. So with the greater knowledge of old age, the greater data set over which to generalize, comes a wider set of experience and an increased depth of knowledge and a longer experience of comparing and contrasting things to find the true connections between them. Okay, all that seems true and accurate to me. Continuing. A complete and adequate notion of life can never be attained by anyone who does not reach old age. For it is only the old man who sees life whole and knows its natural course. It is only he who is acquainted, and this is most important, not only with its entrance, like the rest of mankind, but with its exit too, so that he alone has a full sense of its utter vanity, whilst the others never cease to labor under the false notion that everything will come right in the end. Let's say it's the old man who finally sees the vanity of life. Nobody who doesn't make it that far really has a true picture of what human life is generally like. On the other hand, there is more conceptive power in youth, and at that time of life, a man can make more out of the little that he knows. In age, judgment, penetration, and thoroughness predominate. Youth is the time for amassing the material for a knowledge of the world that shall be distinctive and peculiar, for an original view of life. In other words, the legacy that a man of genius leaves to his fellow men. It is, however, only in later years that he becomes master of his material. Accordingly, it will be found that, as a rule, a great writer gives his best work to the world when he is about 50 years of age. But though the tree of knowledge must reach its full height before it can bear fruit, the roots of it lie in youth. We see here over and over again Schopenhauer in this part, going back and forth between the advantages of youth, the advantages of age, the places in which we should judge truly about where each area seems to be strongest, where each age of life seems to have an advantage over the other. Every generation, no matter how paltry its character, thinks itself much wiser than the one immediately preceding it, let alone those that are more remote. It is just the same with the different periods of a man's life. And yet often, in the one case no less than in the other, it is a mistaken opinion. In the years of physical growth, when our powers of mind and our stores of knowledge are receiving daily additions, it becomes a habit for today to look down with contempt upon yesterday. The habit strikes root and remains even after the intellectual powers have begun to decline, when today should rather look up with respect to yesterday. So it is that we often unduly depreciate the achievements as well as the judgments of our youth. So, advice to us in terms of our own autobiography. When we are young, every day we seem to be getting better, and when we're 22, we look back on when we were 20 with a certain amount of elevation, right? We feel that we've come far. But he said already, after the age of 35, the intellectual powers begin to decline. When I'm 47, I ought not to look back at my 43-year-old self as though he was certainly less wise than myself. At a certain point in time, I've peaked, and I ought to be looking not down but up in respect at my past self. So, an important reminder to avoid a certain kind of chronological snobbery, or not to carry the conclusions that are accurate in our youth into our maturity and old age, to be sensitive to when that curve reverses. This seems the place for making the general observation that although in its main qualities a man's intellect or head, as well as his character or heart, is innate, yet the former is by no means so unalterable in its nature as the latter. Okay. And just to map that out, the intellect can be changed, but character, Schopenhauer thinks, is fixed. The fact is that the intellect is subject to very many transformations, which, as a rule, do not fail to make their actual appearance. And this is so, partly because the intellect has a deep foundation in the physique, and partly because the material with which it deals is given in experience. Okay. So what are the two factors that cause intellect to be changeable? One, it's connected with our body and with the brain, whereas our character is not. And two, it's the intellect is working upon experience, which can grow, which can change, which is constantly getting new input, whereas character is not. Character is not responding to our experience in that same way. And so, from a physical point of view, we find that if a man has any peculiar power, it first gradually increases in strength until it reaches its acme, after which it enters upon a path of slow decadence until it ends in imbecility. But on the other hand, we must not lose sight of the fact that the material which gives employment to a man's powers and keeps them in activity, the subject matter of thought and knowledge, experience, intellectual attainments, the practice of seeing to the bottom of things, and so a perfect mental vision, form themselves a mass which continues to, form in themselves a mass which continues to increase in size until the time comes when weakness shows itself and the man's powers suddenly fail. He's speaking here about the growth of knowledge and intellect. As I learn more and more, all of these things together can increase and increase and increase in size as I get older, and then my intellectual powers fail, I become senile, and it's all capable of a rapid change downward. Okay, so we're talking about change in the realm of the intellect. It can grow and it can collapse rapidly over the course of our lives. The way in which these two distinguishable elements combine in the same nature, the one absolutely unalterable, that's character, and the other subject to change in two directions opposed to each other, okay, and that's intellect, which can either grow or decline. The way in which these two elements combine explains the variety of mental attitude and the dissimilarity of value which attach to a man at different periods of life. So we might say that if character is unalterable, we'll have to spot Schopenhauer this. We can contest it later. But intellect can go up and down. Well, then we would expect that a man who becomes senile, but it was a real SOB, and his character will be a senile SOB, right? A person who is kind and generous, a person who has a certain kind of magnanimous character, will retain that character as his knowledge grows and as his knowledge and intellectual powers decrease, whether gradually or suddenly. That seems to provide the sort of constant, unchanging focus or character of a man's life. The same truth may be more broadly expressed by saying that the first 40 years of life furnished the text, while the remaining 30 supply the commentary, and that without the commentary we are unable to understand aright the true sense and coherence of the text, together with the moral it contains and all the subtle application of which it admits. That's the passage I referred to at the beginning of this video. I like that very much. That the first 4 decades of life are writing the text of our lives, collecting the experience, and then the latter, from ages 40 to 70, latter 3 decades of our life, are a commentary which unlocks the inner meaning that is present in those years. So we don't really have a full grasp only from the textual reading. We need the commentary in order to appreciate the subtlety that is there. That's really when the real business of life gets going, it seems, is when we're composing and elaborating and drawing out all the subtleties of the text that is there through our commentary upon it. I kind of like that image, though maybe it's a little bit bookish for some of us. Going on. Towards the close of life, much the same thing happens as at the end of a bal masque. The masks are taken off. Then you can see who the people really are with whom you have come into contact in your passage through the world. For by the end of life, characters have come out in their true light, actions have borne fruit, achievements have been rightly appreciated, and all shams have fallen to pieces. For this, time was in every case requisite. The word time capitalized there. It just occurred to me right now, this is, in a sense, this is kind of like Schopenhauer as the not quite so malicious version of Heath Ledger's Joker from the movie The Dark Knight. That he says when people, just before people die, they show you who they really are. Take out the murder element in that quip, and Schopenhauer is saying much the same thing about the natural end of life. When people come to the end of their life, the masks come off, and we see who everybody really was underneath. So all the shams have fallen to pieces, actions have borne fruit, achievements have been rightly appreciated. We all stand, as it were, kind of face to face, naked before each other. And here's what I truly am, that's what you truly are. As we approach death, he seems to say. But the most curious fact is that it is also only towards the close of life that a man really recognizes and understands his own true self, the aims and objects he has followed in life, more especially the kind of relation in which he has stood to other people and to the world. It will often happen that as a result of this knowledge, a man will have to assign himself a lower place than he formerly thought was his due. But there are exceptions to this rule, and it will occasionally be the case that he will take a higher position than he had before. This will be owing to the fact that he had no adequate notion of the baseness of the world, and that he set up a higher aim for himself than was followed by the rest of mankind. The progress of life shows a man the stuff of which he is made. So interesting, right? At the end of life, not only do we see other people as they truly are, we see ourselves. We come to understand ourselves as we truly are. And quite frequently, we'll find out that we weren't as good as we thought we were. But the exception is the person who rather naively misjudges the baseness of the world, expects more of the world and of other people than they are going to deliver. That person may find that he raises his estimation of himself as a person of quality among the other people among whom he's lived at the end of life. It is customary to call youth the happy and age the sad part of life. This would be true if it were the passions that made a man happy. Youth is swayed to and fro by them, and they give a great deal of pain and little pleasure. In age, the passions cool and leave a man at rest. And then forthwith his mind takes a contemplative tone. The intellect is set free and attains the upper hand. And since in itself intellect is beyond the range of pain, a man feels happy just insofar as his intellect is the predominating part of him. It need only be remembered that all pleasure is negative and that pain is positive in its nature. That's the insight with which we began Counsels and Maxims. In order to see that the passions can never be a source of happiness, and that age is not the less to be envied on the ground that many pleasures are denied it. For every sort of pleasure is never anything more than the quieting of some need or longing, and that pleasure should come to an end as soon as the need ceases is no more a subject of complaint than that a man cannot go on eating after he has had his dinner, or fall asleep again after a good night's rest. I might add here as well, if Schopenhauer is right about pleasure being simply the negation of pain, I might say that, it is pleasant to scratch an itch, but of course I only scratch so long as I itch. If the itch goes away, I stop scratching, but I don't lament that I no longer am able to experience the pleasure of scratching. The pleasure of scratching was simply relieving the itch, which I found intolerable otherwise. So it's what we would call pleasure and chase after, struggle after, if we were sort of the prey of will, is in fact simply, it's just scratching an itch. Right? And the fact that I can't do that, don't have to do that in old age, I should say, should be a great consolation to me rather than a source of disquiet and lament. So far from youth being the happiest period of life, there is much more truth in the remark made by Plato at the beginning of the Republic that the prize should rather be given to old age, because then at least a man is freed from the animal passion which has hitherto never ceased to disquiet him. Nay, it may even be said that the countless and manifold humors which have their source in this passion, and the emotions that spring from it, produce a mild state of madness. And this lasts as long as the man is subject to the spell of the impulse, this evil spirit, as it were, of which there is no riddance, so that he never really becomes a reasonable being until the passion is extinguished. Since he mentions Republic, and I mentioned Republic once earlier in talking about Schopenhauer's treatment of old age, I actually got one of my copies of Republic off the shelf behind me and looked up this passage from Book 1 of Republic. It's around 329, Stephanus number. Socrates is speaking with Cephalus. Socrates here is younger, Cephalus is an older man, and Socrates asks him, this is reading from Republic now just because I want to. I'd gladly find out from you what you think about this, as you have reached the point in life that the poets call the threshold of old age. Is it a difficult time? What do you report about it? Asks young Socrates. Cephalus replies, By God, Socrates, I'll tell you exactly what I think. A number of us who are more or less the same age often get together in accordance with the old saying. When we meet, the majority complain about the lost pleasures they remember from their youth, those of sex, drinking parties, feasts, and the other things that go along with them. And they get angry as if they had been deprived of important things and had lived well then, but are now hardly living at all. Okay, I'm skipping a bit. He says, I don't think they blame the real cause, Socrates. For if old age were really the cause, I should have suffered in the same way, and so should everyone else of my age. But as it is, I, says Cephalus, have met some who don't feel that like that in the least. Indeed, I was once present when someone asked the poet Sophocles, How are you as far as sex goes, Sophocles? Can you still make love with a woman? Quiet, man, the poet replied. I am very glad to have escaped from all that, like a slave who has escaped from a savage and tyrannical master. I thought at the time that he was right, and I still do, for old age brings peace and freedom from all such things. When the appetites relax and cease to importune us, everything Sophocles said comes to pass, and we escape from many mad masters. So that's the source. That's Plato writing Cephalus, quoting Sophocles in Book 1 of Plato's Republic, saying that being old is like escaping from a cruel and tyrannical master, or many mad masters, the passions who've driven me forward without rest. And so what I really am experiencing now is freedom at last, freedom finally from the passions. So that was Plato. Going back now to Schopenhauer. There is no doubt that in general, and apart from individual circumstances and particular dispositions, youth is marked by a certain melancholy and sadness, while genial sentiments attach to old age. And the reason of this is nothing but the fact that the young man is still under the service, nay, the forced labor imposed by that evil spirit, which scarcely ever leaves him a moment to himself. To this source may be traced, directly or indirectly, almost all and every ill that befalls or menaces mankind. The old man is genial and cheerful because, after long lying in the bonds of passion, he can now move about in freedom. Okay, so saying essentially what I was just saying before, that once the blood cools, once these passions no longer drive your action, you are in old age, right? You experience a certain kind of peace. So going on. Still, it should not be forgotten that when this passion is extinguished, the true kernel of life is gone, and nothing remains but the hollow shell. Or, from another point of view, life then becomes like a comedy, which, begun by real actors, is continued and brought to an end by automata dressed in their clothes. Okay, there are two great images in this short paragraph. One I want you to keep in mind for the end of this section today, that once passion is extinguished, the kernel of life, the kernel with a K, is gone, and all remains is the hollow shell. Maybe think of a walnut where the nut is gone and you just have the walnut shell. Okay, that's all that's left after passion is gone, which seems pretty harsh. And then the second, life is like a comedy, begun by real actors, but they leave after Act 1 and the rest of the play is finished by robots, automata, puppets, dressed in the same costumes. And that's what old age is like, living without passion. Okay, pretty grim. Again, although perhaps remembering to be a pessimist, we might take it in stride. Okay. Schopenhauer continues. However that may be, youth is the period of unrest, and age of repose. And from that very circumstance, the relative degree of pleasure belonging to each may be inferred. The child stretches out its little hands in the eager desire to seize all the pretty things that meet its sight, charmed by the world because all its senses are still so young and fresh. Much the same thing happens with the youth, and he displays greater energy in his quest. He too is charmed by all the pretty things and the many pleasing shapes that surround him, and forthwith his imagination conjures up pleasures which the world can never realize, which the world can never give him. So he is filled with an ardent desire for he knows not what delights, robbing him of all rest and making happiness impossible. But when old age is reached, all this is over and done with, partly because the blood runs cooler and the senses are no longer so easily allured, partly because experience has shown the true value of things and the futility of pleasure, whereby illusion has been gradually dispelled, and the strange fancies and prejudices which previously concealed or distorted a free and true view of the world have been dissipated and put to flight, with the result that a man can now get a juster and clearer view and see things as they are, and also, in a measure, attain more or less insight into the nullity of all things on this earth. That's Schopenhauer going hard in for the pessimism right there. What does the old man know? Well, his blood is cooler. He's less driven by sort of the internal drives and struggle of will, of passion, of striving, of wanting. But also, he's had more experience of the futility of pleasure. I've gotten pleasure and it didn't last. It wasn't all that. And he's gradually replaced the illusions of youth, the supposition that there's some great pleasure out there if only I struggle for it hard enough, has been replaced now with a true view of reality, of human life, of himself, a juster and clearer view of human existence. Final paragraph of this section now. It is this that gives almost every old man, no matter how ordinary his faculties may be, a certain tincture of wisdom, which distinguishes him from the young. But the chief result of all this change is the peace of mind that ensues, a great element of happiness, and in fact the condition and essence of it, peace of mind. While the young man fancies that there is a vast amount of good things in the world, if only he could come at them, the old man is steeped in the truth of the preacher's words, that all things are vanity, knowing that however gilded the shell, the nut is hollow. Okay. There's the payoff of that earlier reference to the nut and the kernel, the shell and the kernel. However gilded the shell, however beautiful the walnut shell, there's nothing inside of it. Right? There's nothing to struggle, to strive for. This seems to be Schopenhauer's lesson at the end of this section, contrasting old age with youth. In the next section, Schopenhauer will begin with Horace's maxim, nil admirare, be surprised by nothing. We will take a look at that and getting towards the end of this chapter and of this book in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. In this penultimate section of The Ages of Life, the final chapter of Counsels and Maxims, Schopenhauer praises the life of old age and talks about its many advantages. These chiefly flow from the fact that in old age, a person has given up the illusions that have distorted his judgment about the world and about himself when he's young. Schopenhauer also defends old age against the mistaken belief that it is necessarily a time of disease and boredom. And he takes up the question of self-sufficiency again. It is in old age when a person seems to have to rely most fully upon what he is in himself instead of what the world gives to him. This section ends with a nice Spanish proverb about living a long life. Here's how Schopenhauer begins. In these later years, and not before, a man comes to a true appreciation of Horace's maxim, nil admirari, that is, let yourself be surprised by nothing. He is directly and sincerely convinced of the vanity of everything, and that all the glories of the world are as nothing. His illusions are gone. He is no more beset with the idea that there is any particular amount of happiness anywhere, in the palace or in the cottage, any more than he himself enjoys when he is free from bodily or mental pain. The worldly distinctions of great and small, high and low, exist for him no longer, and in this blissful state of mind, the old man may look down with a smile upon all false notions. He is completely undeceived, and knows that whatever may be done to adorn human life and to deck it out in finery, its paltry character will soon show through the glitter of its surroundings, and that, paint and bejewel it as one may, it remains everywhere much the same, an existence which has no true value except in freedom from pain, and is never to be estimated by the presence of pleasure, let alone then of display. So, in the first paragraph here, Schopenhauer, a nice, eloquent praise of old age, sort of looking down upon the falsehoods of the world, having finally been able, in some measure, to transcend and escape them, and knowing that the only real value in life is to be free from pain. So I look at a very wealthy person, I look at Elon Musk, and I say, well, is he free from pain? If yes, then he's just as well off as I, who am also free from pain. That's the only good to be sought in this life. The fact that he's wealthy, that experiences pleasure in excess of mine, the greater amount of pleasure means nothing. Seems to be what Schopenhauer is saying. The old person is capable of seeing and truly believing. So, continuing now. Disillusion is the chief characteristic of old age. For by that time the fictions are gone which gave life its charm and spurred on the mind to activity. The splendors of the world have been proved null and vain. Its pomp, grandeur, and magnificence are faded. A man has then found out that behind most of the things he wants, and most of the pleasures he longs for, there is very little after all. And so he comes by degrees to see that our existence is all empty and void. It is only when he is 70 years old that he quite understands the first words of the preacher. That was vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And this again explains why it is that old men are sometimes fretful and morose. It is often said that the common lot of old age is disease and weariness of life. Disease is by no means essential to old age, especially when a really long span of years is to be attained. For as life goes on, the conditions of health and disorder tend to increase. Crescente vita, crescit sanitas et morbus. That as life increases, health and death increase, health and disease increase. And as far as weariness or boredom is concerned, I have stated above why old age is even less exposed to that form of evil than youth. But we remember that, right? Youth, because of its fast-moving time, is susceptible to boredom. Time moves by at a different pace for the old, so they're not subject to it as much. Nor is boredom by any means to be taken as a necessary accompaniment of that solitude which, for reasons that do not require to be explained, old age certainly cannot escape. It is rather the fate that awaits those who have never known any other pleasures but the gratification of the senses and the delights of society, who have left their minds unenlightened and their faculties unused. And this is Schopenhauer's reply to the charge, maybe the common belief that old people are subject to boredom. One, no, it's young people who are rather more subject to boredom. But two, now there is a certain amount of solitude which inevitably comes with old age, but that is only a source of boredom for people who have not developed their intellectual faculties sufficiently, people who have lived a sensuous life or a sociable life, find all their pleasures in the body or in the company of others. Well, plainly, those people, when the solitude that is inevitable in old age comes upon them, those people will suffer. But one need not suffer like that, and a person who is growing old can, by the right kind of intellectual practice and enlightenment, uh, learn to endure it. So he goes on. It is quite true that the intellectual faculties decline with the approach of old age, but where they were originally strong, there will always be enough left to combat the onslaught of boredom. And then again, as I have said, experience, knowledge, reflection, and skill in dealing with men combine to give an old man an increasingly accurate insight into the ways of the world. His judgment becomes keen, and he attains a coherent view of life. His mental vision embraces a wider range. Constantly finding new uses for his stores of knowledge, and adding to them at every opportunity, he maintains uninterrupted that inward process of self-education which gives employment and satisfaction to the mind, and thus forms the due reward of all its efforts. The point here again being that disease is not the necessary accompaniment of old age, neither is boredom. Boredom afflicts the sociable and the sensual. The person who has practiced the right kind of intellectual discipline will find that his powers are near their peak, with the great store of good judgment, of prudence, of experience. He sees the world more and more accurately. He's able to behave in a more canny way in making correct judgments about how things are going to turn out. He should constantly find new fields of application for his knowledge. Going on now. All this serves, in some measure, as a compensation for decreased intellectual power. And besides, time, as I have remarked, seems to go much more quickly when we are advanced in years. And this, in itself, is a preventative of boredom. There is no great harm in the fact that a man's bodily strength decreases in old age, unless indeed he requires it to make a living. To be poor when one is old is a great misfortune. If a man is secure from that, and retains his health, old age may be a very passable time of life. Its chief necessity is to be comfortable and well off, and in consequence money is then prized more than ever, because it is a substitute for failing strength. This next part's great. Deserted by Venus, the old man likes to turn to Bacchus to make him merry. In place of wanting to see things, to travel, and to learn, comes the desire to speak and teach. It is a piece of good fortune if the old man retains some of his love of study, or of music, or of the theatre, if, in general, he is still somewhat susceptible to the things about him, as is indeed the case with some people to a very late age. At that time of life, what a man has in himself is of greater advantage to him than ever it was before. And I would just add, this is because bodily strength decreases, sociability decreases, you are deprived of the pleasures of the senses and the pleasures of sociability of other people's company. This is part of the inevitable solitude of old age, that what you have in yourself makes up a greater and greater portion of whatever kind of life you can live. If you are a good self, an excellent self, if you have maintained yourself, you will be able to pass your old age in relative comfort and ease. If you've taken poor care of yourself, when you're left alone with yourself, you will find it rather difficult. Okay, going on now. There can be no doubt that most people who have never been anything but dull and stupid become more and more of automata as they grow old. They have always thought, said, and done the same things as their neighbors, and nothing that happens now can change their disposition or make them act otherwise. To talk to old people of this kind is like writing in the sand. If you produce any impression at all, it is gone almost immediately. Old age is here nothing but the caput mortuum of life. The phrase literally means dead head, but it refers to a kind of worthless residue left behind after a chemical reaction. So it's kind of just like residue of life. All that is essential to manhood is gone. There are cases in which nature supplies a third set of teeth in old age, thereby apparently demonstrating the fact that that period of life is a second childhood. I have to say, I have no idea what Schopenhauer is referring to. Perhaps that's an established medical fact. Perhaps it's just a sort of urban legend of mid-19th century Germany. I couldn't say. It is certainly a very melancholy thing that all a man's faculties tend to waste away as he grows old, and at any rate that and at a rate that increases in rapidity. But still, this is a necessary, nay, a beneficial arrangement, for otherwise death, for which it is a preparation, would be too hard to bear. So the greatest boon that follows the attainment of extreme old age is euthanasia, an easy death, not ushered in by disease, and free from all pain and struggle. There's a footnote here. Footnote says, see Weltanschauung und Vorstellung, Book 2, Chapter 41, for a further description of this happy end to life. Let me get to the end of this paragraph, and then I'll tell you more about that footnote. For let a man live as long as he may, he is never conscious of any moment but the present, one and indivisible. And in those late years the mind loses more every day by sheer forgetfulness than it ever gains anew. That's the end of this paragraph about euthanasia. What Schopenhauer has said so far here is that our faculties, it is actually beneficial to us that our faculties decline, and somewhat rapidly, as we approach death. If we maintained our faculties vivid and sharp right up to the end, death would be difficult or impossible to bear. So he holds out this possibility of euthanasia, not meaning here medically assisted death, but meaning a good death, dying well, which for him means dying free of pain, discomfort, and distress. And he says, check out Book 2, Chapter 41 of The World as Will and Representation. I happen to have Book 2 of Word as Will of that book here, and I looked up the passage he's talking about in Chapter 41. It is on page 469 of this Dover edition, the Payne translation. Here's some of what he says there, and then I'll go back to Counsels and Maxims. On page 468, at the start of this paragraph, he says, according to this, what makes death so terrible for us is not so much the end of life, for this cannot seem to anyone specially worthy of regret, as the destruction of the organism, really because this organism is the will itself manifested as body. Okay, we remember that will for Schopenhauer is a bad thing. This is the sort of the struggle of life, the sort of cosmic force striving towards what can never be attained. Okay, let me skip ahead a little bit. Let me do a little bit more here in 468. But actually, we feel this destruction only in the evils of illness or of old age. On the other hand, for the subject, death itself consists merely in the moment when consciousness vanishes, since the activity of the brain ceases. The extension of the stoppage to all the other parts of the organism which follows this is really already an event after death. Therefore, in a subjective respect, death concerns only consciousness. He goes on to talk in the middle of this paragraph about violent death, and then he talks about peaceful death. And here's the passage he referred to in that footnote just a moment ago. And finally, even death through natural causes, proper, death through old age, euthanasia, is a gradual vanishing and passing out of existence in an imperceptible manner. In old age, passions and desires, together with the susceptibility to their objects, are gradually extinguished. The emotions no longer find any excitement, for the power to make representations or mental pictures becomes weaker and weaker, and its images feebler. The impressions no longer stick to us, but pass away without a trace. The days roll by faster and faster, events lose their significance, everything grows pale. The old man, stricken in years, totters about or rests in a corner, now only a shadow, a ghost of his former self. What still remains there for death to destroy? One day a slumber is his last, and his dreams are blank. They are the dreams that Hamlet asks about in the famous monologue. I believe that we dream them just now. Okay, I think that's a good place to stop there. You can check out more of chapter 41 of book 2 of The World as Will and Representation if you want to know more of Schopenhauer's thoughts about death. Let me go back to the final pages of this section from Counsels and Maxims. Thanks for indulging me for that interlude there. So where were we? The mind loses more every day by sheer forgetfulness than it ever gains anew. So the decline of our intellectual powers is actually quite quite good for us, right? It prepares us for death. It allows us to just sort of slip effortlessly into nothingness, as was described just a moment ago. Going on. The main difference between youth and age will always be that youth looks forward to life and old age to death. And that while the one has a short past and a long future before it, the case is just the opposite with the other. It is quite true that when a man is old, to die is the only thing that awaits him, while if he is young, he may expect to live. And the question arises, which of the two fates is the more hazardous? And if life is not a matter which, on the whole, it is better to have behind one than before. Does not the preacher say, the day of death is better than the day of one's birth? It is certainly a rash thing to wish for a long life. For, as the Spanish proverb has it, it means to see much evil. Quien larga vida vive, mucho mal vide. Whoever lives a long life sees much evil. Okay. That's the end of the section here, but I wanted to make two more comments about what Schopenhauer has said. It occurs to me, he's got a sort of nice, eloquent passage here about the young man has much life ahead of him, the old man has only death ahead of him, and who has the better of it at that moment. And it seems to me almost here that Schopenhauer is kind of imitating Socrates as Plato presents him in Apology, who says at the end, after he's been condemned, the last lines of Apology, in fact, we part now, I to die and you to live, and who has the better lot is known only to the god. I think Schopenhauer here is kind of imitating that, but saying actually it's just the opposite of what you might have thought in terms of Socrates. It is, in fact, the man facing death. Perhaps that's precisely what you might have thought reading Apology. And then the last thing here, there is a footnote here in that final sentence with the Spanish proverb where he says, it is certainly a rash thing to live for a long life. There's a long footnote here by Schopenhauer, and I'll conclude this video with that. The life of man cannot, strictly speaking, be called either long or short, since it is the ultimate standard by which duration of time in regard to all other things is measured. In one of the Vedic Upanishads, the natural length of human life is put down at 100 years. And I believe this to be right. I have observed as a matter of fact that it is only people who exceed the age of 90 who attain euthanasia, who die, that is to say, of no disease, apoplexy or convulsion, and pass away without agony of any sort, nay, who sometimes even show no pallor, but expire generally in a sitting attitude, and often after a meal, or, I may say, simply cease to live rather than die. To come to one's end before the age of 90 means to die of disease, in other words, prematurely. Now, the Old Testament puts the limit of human life at 70, and if it is very long, at 80 years. And what is more noticeable still, Herodotus says the same thing. But this is wrong. And the error is due simply to a rough and superficial estimate of the results of daily experience. For if the natural length of life were from 70 to 80 years, people would die, about that time, of mere old age. Now this is certainly not the case. If they die then, they die, like younger people, of disease. And disease is something abnormal. Therefore, it is not natural to die at that age. It is only when they are between 90 and 100 that people die of old age. Die, I mean, without suffering from any disease or showing any special signs of their condition, such as a struggle, death rattle, convulsion, pallor, the absence of all of which constitutes euthanasia. The natural length of a human life is 100 years, and in assigning that limit, the Upanishads are right once more. Those are the final words, that long footnote from the final sentence of this part of the ages of life towards the end of Counsels and Maxims. All that remains in this chapter and in this book is a short 2-page section comparing the ages of human life to the planets. And that's a very interesting section I'll be anxious to share with you in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. Hi. In this 7th and final section of The Ages of Life, Schopenhauer concludes his work Counsels and Maxims by comparing the different stages of a human life to the planets. I should note that Schopenhauer will deal here only with 8 planets. Pluto was not discovered until the 1930s, long after this was written in 1850, and the planet Neptune was discovered only, I think, in 1846, shortly before this book was composed. You'll see him make mention of that. Here's what he writes. Let's see. A man's individual character is not, as astrology wishes to make out, to be predicted from observation of the planets, but the course of human life in general, as far as the various periods of it are concerned, may be likened to the succession of the planets, so that we may be said to pass under the influence of each one of them in turn. At 10, Mercury is in the ascendant, and at that age a man, like this planet, is characterized by extreme mobility within a narrow sphere, where trifles have a great effect upon him. But under the guidance of so crafty and eloquent a god, he easily makes great progress. Venus begins her sway during his 20th year, and then a man is wholly given up to the love of women. At 30, Mars comes to the front, and he is now all energy and strength, daring, pugnacious, and arrogant. When a man reaches the age of 40, he is under the rule of the 4 asteroids. That is to say, his life has gained something in extension. He is frugal. In other words, by the help of Ceres, he favors what is useful. He has his own hearth by the influence of Vesta. Pallas has taught him that which is necessary for him to know, and his wife, his Juno, rules as the mistress of his house. Footnote, Schopenhauer's footnote. The other asteroids, which have been discovered since, are an innovation, and I shall have nothing to do with them. My relation to them is that of professors of philosophy to me. I ignore them because they do not suit my book. Back to the text. But at the age of 50, Jupiter is the dominant influence. At that period, a man has outlived most of his contemporaries, and he can feel himself superior to the generation about him. He is still in the full enjoyment of his strength, and rich in experience and knowledge. And if he has any power and position of his own, he is endowed with authority over all who stand in his immediate surroundings. He is no more inclined to receive orders from others. He wants to take command himself. The work most suitable to him now is to guide and rule within his own sphere. This is the point where Jupiter culminates, and where a man of 50 years is at his best. Then comes Saturn, at about the age of 60, a weight as of lead, dull and slow. And here he quotes Shakespeare. But old folks, many feign as they were dead, unwieldy, slow, heavy, and pale as lead. That's from Romeo and Juliet, Act 2, Scene 5. Last of all, Uranus, or, as the saying is, a man goes to heaven. I cannot find a place for Neptune, as this planet has been very, very thoughtlessly named, because I may not call it as it should be called, Eros. Otherwise, I should point out how beginning and end meet together, and how closely and intimately Eros is connected with death, how Orcus, or Amenethes, as the Egyptians called him, is not only the receiver, but the giver of all things. Lemathon kai didos, which I think refers to something like their being born as twins, Eros and death. Okay. Death is the great reservoir of life. Everything comes from Orcus. Everything that is alive now was once there. Could we but understand the great trick by which that is done, all would be clear. And those are the final words of Counsels and Maxims by Arthur Schopenhauer. A very fun little comparison here, walking us through the different stages of life, decade by decade, with sort of Jupiter as being the commanding figure when a person is at his sort of the peak of his powers, and then the decline into old age, senility, and heaven. The suggestion that the planet Neptune ought to have been named the planet Eros, so that would have been fun if that had been the case. But and Schopenhauer's great footnote. Right? I'd simply ignore them because they don't suit my book, just as the professors of philosophy have marginalized and ignored me. So there's the conclusion of Counsels and Maxims, and of this series about Counsels and Maxims. My final thoughts on Schopenhauer and on this work, I found him to be surprisingly humane and enjoyable. He's a witty writer. He gives, I think, some very good advice, what I've several times in this series called dad advice, as though he's just a sort of elderly figure letting us know, hey, look, kid, this is how the world is, and here's how you can conduct yourself to be a little bit less miserable than you would have been if you hadn't listened to me. I think, although he gets bitter at some places, and there are a few places where I think a certain kind of personal animosity shines through, I think for the most part, Schopenhauer is able to be, how shall I put this? He's acerbic without being acid, and I think he's misanthropic, but a sort of humane misanthropy. He's misanthropic without being malicious. He doesn't seem to have it out for people he regards as inferior. He simply wants to live free of them and to give advice to people whom he thinks might profit by it, people who have a sort of superior intellectual capability and struggle then in society. He wants them to have this kind of self-understanding. He also does a fairly good job of occasionally, but not in an overwhelming way, linking some of his practical advice here to his metaphysical theories about the will, the idea that there's this sort of life force behind and underneath all of the universe, all of the living universe, that drives us to sort of strive and struggle towards something, but that our ultimate happiness comes, especially we realize this in old age, our ultimate happiness will come from simply giving up on and abstaining from that struggle and seeking a certain kind of inner peace. So I appreciate you staying with this series all the way to the end and with this book. If you have some opinions about it or you'd like me to take on some other project of Schopenhauer's, please leave a comment on this video or elsewhere. Thanks very much. Thanks for watching today, and goodbye.